Welcome to the Heart of CIRS podcast. I'm your hostess, Melanie Joy Pensack, here to share heartfelt conversations with folks recovering from CIRS and with those special people serving the CIRS community. The podcast was created to help bring awareness to the physical, emotional, and mental experiences of folks navigating CIRS day to day. The world needs to know what CIRS folks go through for deeper empathy and understanding. Through stories and vulnerability, we can help the world understand the winding journey of CIRS recovery. Thank you for being here to open your mind and to open your heart. Welcome, everybody. Today is a very special day on the Heart of CIRS podcast. I'm excited to have Brenda Stewart here. Brenda Stewart is a highly respected trauma therapist, certified EMDR therapist, speaker, and author. She understands CIRS both personally and professionally and is passionate about helping people overcome life's challenges. Brenda holds an MA in clinical mental health counseling from Regent University and is a licensed mental health counselor in Florida, a licensed professional counselor in South Carolina, and a certified tribal healer through First Nation Medical Board. Brenda provides both individual and group therapy, and she is just a delight to know. I'm so glad that you're a part of the CIRS community and that we have connected. Welcome to the show, Brenda.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here, and I just really appreciate this opportunity and what you do for the CIRS community.
Thank you. I always like to start out with people touching on their own CIRS journey. It's so important for people to know that a lot of the people that are in the field have experienced CIRS so they can feel like they can trust their professionals. And I wanted to hear some of the key red flags of your own CIRS journey that you'd like to share in a way that might help people put the pieces together in terms of exposure, or maybe when you started to develop CIRS. What can you tell us about your own experience?
Sure, that's a big question, so I'll try to be succinct. My CIRS journey, I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back now, understanding CIRS more really started a long time ago. And I'll break it up into two parts. When it first started, I had a diagnosed eating disorder, and I had been in treatment, been on feeding tubes, all of the things, and really just couldn't seem to recover. I had the desire, I had the skills, I wanted to recover, but there was something that just was keeping me stuck. And looking back now, I see that that was how CIRS manifested in me in a big way with where it impacted my brain. And so it started out noticing that some anxiety, depression through high school, college, into my 20s was when I really dealt with that. And then really struggled with the neuroinflammation. But at that point, I thought, what is wrong with me? I was like, I shouldn't be like this. I know better than this. What is wrong? And so I just turned into a lot of self-contempt and self-judgment. And then back in about 2007, I started to have excruciating chronic pain. And I went through a lot of different medical treatments, epidurals, trigger injections, chiropractic, acupuncture, all of the things, and nothing would touch it. And so I went to a bunch of doctors and people couldn't really figure it out. And so I just said, I guess this is life. When I tried to just figure out how to manage it and move forward and keep having to work and do all the things. And then fast forward to part two is I don't think I was in daily exposure or living in daily exposure during those years. I would have hits and have exposure in different places. So it was a slow buildup, I guess, internally, or slow damage, acceleration, until I moved back to Florida. And I was in a workplace and then with the outdoor air, indoor air, just in constant exposure. And it was like the intensity level just skyrocketed. I couldn't do numbers. I couldn't do math. I own a business and I couldn't figure out bookkeeping. I couldn't find words. I had lumps all over my body that no one could figure out. Was on outside of client sessions. I was on ice packs all the time, lethargy, fatigue, and then all of the like MCAS and everything was just going out of whack. And so I also experienced significant weight gain and nobody could figure out why. It was at that point that I just I wasn't okay with just diagnosis of fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue and chronic pain. And I was like, I feel like I'm 90 and I'm not. And so I just kept advocating and finding and searching until finally I found a functional medicine doctor who had just been at the CIRS conference the month before. And I saw her and she said, let me run some symptom clusters by you. And I had symptoms in all 13. So that's when she took me to the diagnostic process and finally found what has been happening. But it took me about 8 years of that constant search since the symptoms skyrocketed to figure it out. So,
It's always so hard to hear how many years it takes people to sometimes get to that diagnosis or get to that
Mhm.
root cause. What good fortune you had to find a doctor that had just been to the conference too, because it's fresh in their brain. They're excited about it probably. And so then how did you decide to then start working with SIRS patients and you doing trauma work with them and doing counseling and therapeutic services with them?
Yeah, so I have my own practice in Florida, and I specialized in treating clients with complex trauma, eating disorders, anxiety, and then the variety of things that go along with it, PTSD, things like that. And so I was familiar and competent and had been a therapist for a while doing that. And when I became aware of SIRS and diagnosed and started researching and studying and learning all of the things, I began to screen clients in my own practice who other providers had deemed chronic cases, or they're just not getting better, or I see them coming in and their desire is to heal and they're implementing the stuff in between sessions that we talk about, but there's just doesn't seem like a reprieve in the symptoms. So I began to ask them the clusters, symptom clusters went through, and if they passed a certain number, then I would encourage them to take the VCS test. And 99% of the time they failed the VCS test. And so then I said, okay, go to survivingwhole.com. Here's a list of doctors, provided some education. And so with that, I realized, wow, it's impacting a lot of people in the therapy world.
Yeah.
I was connected with Dr. Sparks, and she sees the need for it as well. And so we talked, and she brought me onto her practice, specializing in treating patients with SIRS and erythromyalgia. And she's part of First Nation Medical Board. So I was able to be approved as a certified tribal healer, which allows me to then practice across state lines, which is great so that I can be of service to more people.
I was wondering what that meant in terms of practice. And does that mean with Indigenous tribes only or larger, different populations of people?
No, yeah, it can be anybody who becomes a member of the healing. So you pay an annual membership fee, which is very reasonable. It's very minimal. And then I can treat people through that. The Indigenous tribe, First Nation Medical Board has authority over state licensure boards. And so they're really wanting to protect and help people heal with natural root cause Indigenous healing practices. So when they approve me as a provider, I'm able to then see people as long as they're part of the membership.
I love that. Beautiful work. Let's get into a little bit about some of the topics I'm interested to talk with you about today in terms of trauma. I would love to know, starting out, how you would define trauma and the relationship you're seeing between people having a history of emotional and physical trauma and SIRS. But I guess first let's start with the definition or how you see it and define it.
I look at trauma as anything that, any event or situation that overwhelms the person's nervous system's ability to cope at that developmental stage. It can look different for each person. I will add to that definition that typically we find there is a lack of support or corrective experience surrounding the event. For example, I'll use a simple, well, we might find it simple given SIRS and people listening to this. It's not simple if you were the kid having this happen to, but if we think of a kid in a school hallway and a locker falls on them, right? They call out, everybody's in class, nobody hears them, nobody comes until an hour later when classes change. They're crying, they feel left alone, they feel abandoned in it. And then someone says, you're fine. Just get up, go back to class. You weren't hurt. We'll let your parents know. Let the parents know. They go home and nothing's really wasn't really discussed or processed, right? That kid is going to say, this was traumatic for me. They might never want to be near a locker again, or when they're by a locker, they're freaking out. Whereas the same situation could happen, but let's say somebody heard the cry out, came right away, got the locker off, attended to the child, and made sure they were okay. The parents were called, they tuned in, assisted them working through it. Then that kid might be like, oh no, a locker fell on me, but I'm okay.
Mhm.
Right. And so it's whatever is happening around it as well as what overwhelms the ability to cope in that moment.
I love that you've put that lens on it, that it helps me so much personally. And I was listening to a conversation in my grief training with David Kessler and Frank Anderson,
Mhm.
and they were talking about how you get to define if the experience you've gone through is traumatic, which is what you're pointing to, really,
Yes,
and how people can sometimes go through the same experience, like a death of a loved one or something, and one person can see it as traumatic and one person cannot because of the conditions and really what you're pointing to here, the support
Mhm.
and to process it and move through it. And that support piece is just, it's so important. When I think about my own SIRS experience, like the part that was traumatic was when I was not supported and I was hospitalized. When I
Mm.
felt like the doctors, they had no idea what to do with me. Like they kept apologizing. They didn't know what was wrong. And that fact that nobody knew what was wrong, that was like the part that was really impactful on my nervous system when I
For
was so
sure.
vulnerable. I think it's interesting that we to not use the word trauma lightly. Like sometimes
Mm.
people will joke around and say, "Oh,
Yes.
that was so traumatic," because people who really do live and go through this trauma do need the support to heal. And I think that sort of makes light of it in a way.
Very invalidating to people who
Yeah.
have legitimately experienced trauma and are suffering
Yeah.
from the impact.
And for people who are listening, you might I very much identify with having gone through the SIRS experience and part of it being traumatic, like maybe not being supported by your family or having to get rid of belongings. And there may be other people listening who necessarily, they might not say that it was traumatic. Maybe it's really sad and difficult, but that language is something that I think is very personal. And I'm glad you pointed to that support piece in that.
I had one other thing there real
Yeah.
quick. Is
Yeah.
the other piece that can maybe make something traumatic versus it's not for somebody else is the additional life experiences someone has had,
Mhm.
right? So prior to a SIRS diagnosis, if somebody experienced bullying or a death or physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, there's already a lot of trauma endured, and then you add SIRS on top of it or alongside of it, and it then creates it the previous trauma creates more vulnerability for additional trauma.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. What are your thoughts on people having a history of emotional trauma, physical trauma, and SIRS? Are you seeing that people who've had trauma are experiencing SIRS?
I do see a very high correlation. I'm not saying everybody, right? I don't have a statistic in my head of what the research number is, but I do see a really high correlation. And sometimes I think the previous trauma can be the activating event for the SIRS gene to be, in some cases, or at least one of the factors. With SIRS impacting approximately 24% of the population, right? I find it interesting that highly sensitive nervous systems also are about 20 to 25% of the population. And a lot of times, people who are wired with a sensitive nervous system are more susceptible to situations traumatizing them. And so I find there's a big crossover between them.
Right before my SIRS kicked off, I was living in California and I was actually on a beautiful farm
Wow.
and there were wildfires.
Oh, wow.
And they were so intense that there were points where I had my car packed up and would be like on Twitter throughout the night, like looking to see if we would need to
Oh,
evacuate.
sounds so scary.
it was really frightening. And it was the first time I think I really had that like very primal fear of something significant could happen that's out of my control experience.
Hmm.
And then the illness started to show up within that next year, definitely more strongly. And then I tipped over into SIRS. And so I think about that sort of priming my genes in a way, making me a little
Hmm.
more vulnerable, right? And I've heard from other people that I've talked to patient wise where a death has happened and then they have had SIRS come after that. So it's interesting to hear that you're seeing that as well in your practice.
Yeah, I see it in my practice and I also see it in my own life. When I hit part two of my SIRS red flags or key indicators was I had moved back to Florida to help care for my dad who was diagnosed with glioblastoma. And that was also when I started working in a very badly water damaged building. But the two of those combined is then it's like the intensity switch just
Yeah.
went out of control.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because we think, like, I know I've been in water damage buildings in and out throughout my life and consider myself a very functional child and young adult. And so that piece over time, or when they're so close together, can really compound each other. And my SIRS case was very much like one thing after another. And then it was that tipping point as well. Do you find that this is similar for maybe people who don't have a recent trauma, but have developmental trauma?
Yes, because if we look at trauma, and one other thing about trauma is it might not always be an event happening, it could also be the absence of,
Mhm.
right? And so when we look at it through a developmental lens or people in their family of origin or upbringing, it can be outright physical, emotional, psychological abuse, or it could be a lack of attunement. Say somebody had a single parent household and they had to work all the time to keep food on the table, and the child didn't get some of their emotional needs met, right? That can then create core beliefs in a person that shape how they engage with the world and through relationships or even with themselves through time. So it could be an outright event. It could also be the absence of something. And it's not about placing blame. I don't like the blame game of like, I'm not going to tell everyone their parents are horrible because I don't believe that. Sometimes that's the case if there's outright harm. But I think a lot of parents are trying to do the best they can with what they know and the situation. And sometimes there's just a disconnect,
Yeah.
right? There's a misattunement that can happen. I think developmental trauma, it can be trauma impacts your nervous system. And so it creates, you have this part of you that has to continue with daily life and go into the next grade or make meals or grow up and have another birthday and get good grades at school or whatever that is. And so you have this part of you that keeps going with daily life. But then there's these parts of you that hold the trauma that come out in those fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses that a lot of times we don't know until later where they're coming from.
Yeah.
But those traumas, a wound that creates like an armor of protection in order to keep going on with daily life or normal life tasks that keep the nervous system in a high threat state. And so long term, that increases inflammation, increases chronic stress, increases a lot of things that also are part of SIRS or play into SIRS.
Mhm. Yeah, I'll give an example just to confirm what you've said there. It was so triggering for me that those doctors didn't know what was wrong with me. And so now when I encounter another professional that is perplexed by my situation or doesn't seem to know something, it's very internally triggering. Like I can feel that, in me that it's not 100% fully processed yet. And it takes time to work through and see that. But I could see that because then I would get defensive or reactive. And it's like, why am I getting so defensive and reactive? Not everybody knows everything about everything. And it's like, oh yeah, like I can remember in the hospital how scary it was to
Sure.
constantly be told we have no idea what's wrong with you.
It's so understandable when you look at it through that lens, right?
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
course, you're going to be defensive or feel reactive. And we can then hold a lot of compassion for
Yes.
those places where we are reactive because they're coming from pain.
Absolutely. And that's where I'm grateful I've had the mindfulness practice and meditation practice because it just allows me to see it when it comes up and to be more kind to myself in those situations instead of thinking there's something wrong with me, which I think that's what people sometimes do. They start to think there's something wrong with them because they're being reactive or emotional. And it does often have roots, as you're pointing to.
Yeah, absolutely. And those messages of there's something wrong with us or it's not that bad or we're overreacting come so much too when there's a people in our lives who don't understand SIRS, right? And so then it just can become more
Yes,
frustrating and exacerbates those, okay, maybe there is something wrong with me.
absolutely. So, as a trauma-informed mindfulness teacher, I work with people who, as they begin to meditate and they start to maybe see these patterns come up because they're noticing these thoughts or these reactivities in daily life with their partners or people in their neighborhood or community. And it's beyond what can be processed just in the meditation environment. And so I often send people along to therapists for different modalities to help get through and build momentum in the healing process once they get stuck. What kind of modalities are you using and finding are really helpful for trauma in SIRS patients?
Yeah, obviously I use a lot of EMDR when appropriate. And I know some people have bad experiences with EMDR, but EMDR therapists are not a one size fits all. So if you've had a bad experience, don't give up on it. So EMDR, I think brain spotting, somatic experiencing, a lot of body-based modalities I'll pull in. I do a lot of attachment healing. And then I'll utilize things like dialectical behavior therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy for some of the stabilization, the preparation, that kind of education or building a toolbox of how to cope with different things and how to tolerate and how to be able to respond versus react. And then doing a lot more of the polyvagal, vagus nerve stuff, the limbic system work to really, I'm about healing from the inside out. So let's get to the root and really heal from the inside out so that as you heal from SIRS and your body can begin to strengthen and you can get back to things in life, you're also mentally and emotionally prepared as well because they, as holistic beings, right? I consider we're mental, physical, emotional, relational, spiritual beings. And so if we only focus on one element, then the rest are still suffering. And so how do we heal holistically? Because it's so interconnected.
I love that so much. I think everybody wants to know that there's just one program or one way that's the best way, but it sounds like you're pointing to the integration of different things at different times for people to get complete healing.
Yeah, I mean, we're complex, right? The human being, and if anyone's ever taken an anatomy course, we know we're complex. And then you add all the previous life experiences and emotions and the way we're wired and all of the things in there on top of chronic illness. I wish there was a pill that could magically be the answer. I mean, if it's out there or if I can figure out how to do it, I'll let everybody know. But yeah, it's a lot more involved and it requires I have this soft spot inside because it's like when we're all dealing with SIRS, we're just desperate to return to a state of health, right? And so to hear, oh yeah, it's involved and it requires commitment and patience. It's like none of us have any of that anymore, right? So I want to just hold space and compassion for that. I really get it, both personally and from my work with clients, but I do have hope that it's possible.
Yeah.
Right. And sometimes we can't look at the far end goal. We want to hold that with hope and like an air of expectancy, but we just need to look at, okay, what's the next thing
Yeah. The
until
next,
we can get to that next phase.
yeah. Likewise, I wish mindfulness meditation was the cure-all for everything, but it's not. Like sometimes people, they'll ask me, I don't really like to meditate. So should I meditate? And I'm like, no. And they feel really surprised when I say that. And I say because there's so many different types of limbic system trainings. Like some people might love DNRS or love Gupta, or they might prefer mindfulness meditation as their limbic type of process, or they might prefer yoga, or it depends on so many different factors, as we know. And
Hmm.
everybody's biology is so different. It's finding the key that fits your nervous system and your limbic system at that time to help move the
Absolutely.
needle. Because, yeah, one strategy just isn't going to work for everyone. But I want people to know it's okay to try a couple of things. It doesn't mean you're failing or that your body's broken or that you're not going to heal. Sometimes it is like Goldilocks trying to figure out like what's the right fit, you know?
Yeah, I 100% agree. And honestly, I encourage people to have a toolbox,
Yeah.
not literally, but a box of tools that they can use because different things work at different times,
Yeah.
right? And so if we have mindfulness meditation or yoga, or we're doing EMDR therapy, or we're leaning into vagus nerve exercises, right? Sometimes, depending on what's going on, where our brain is at and body's at in the process, different things are going to work differently. So the more tools you can have and really try on, like you were saying, of, oh, this works really well for me in this, but not so well over here. I'm going to implement something else here, can be really effective.
I love somatic experiencing, and I've not done in-person EMDR, but I did an online version when
Uh-huh.
I was homebound for a while, and it was really helpful. So, it's as you're pointing to, things work at different times, and it's okay to try different things and see what works for you. And you can always go back to them as needed in your toolbox. I love that. Any signs that it's not the right time to be going into your trauma or investigating that? How do you judge when is a good time to start working on the trauma and maybe relating that to the protocol?
First of all, I think trauma work, there's a much more expansive view of trauma work than just like delving into the trauma,
Mhm.
right? For example, in EMDR, people think of just the eye movements or the tapping or the alternating sounds, but there's really 8 phases, and one of those phases is the preparation phase, and that's where we're increasing the window of tolerance, building skills, learning to regulate the nervous system. As I answer the question of how do you know when it's not the right time, I think I'm going to focus it on delving into the specific trauma, not necessarily the preparation phase. Okay. So if somebody is not in a safe enough living situation and they are still experiencing immense neuroinflammation and they're in a state of threat response because they aren't in a safe enough space, it is not a good time to delve into the trauma work.
Yeah.
Um, they can do the preparation phase for sure, and we work more on regulating, tolerating, increasing the window of tolerance, responding versus reacting. But going into the specific traumas is not the time. I think the other piece is if somebody's wanting to just come to therapy to talk and then not engage in the work outside of therapy, opening up trauma is probably not the right time for that either. Now, if I'm seeing this person, then we'll get there. But it might, if somebody comes in with the expectation, I'm going to tell you this and it's going to take 3 sessions and I'm going to be fine, that expectation needs to be adjusted. And then people who just aren't necessarily wanting to face reality, I don't want to waste people's time or money investment, right? If they are wanting to stay in a place of avoidance, and I understand this is without any judgment, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes accepting the reality of SIRS and all of the things that go along with it is feels too much. And so people come to terms with it at their own time. But if they're in a place where they're still in a big avoidance or not able to really process through what's going on, then I would say it's not the right time to do the trauma work.
Yeah. Those are great examples. I sometimes in my meditation groups and like one-on-one sessions with people find that people get a little sucked into the narrative, like I have to heal my trauma to move forward, or they get almost like really hyper focused on healing the trauma and like getting into it, but you can tell from a nervous system perspective. And as you're pointing to this preparation phase, I love that process. It doesn't seem like the right time because going into it might further activate them and dysregulate them to a point that might be too much. And I speak from my own experience when I'm working with people is that when the time is right, like you'll know the time is right. You either can't ignore it anymore. It's like, okay, this is like in my face and it's impacting me on a daily life. And I need to look at this. I need to start addressing this. Or I've had in meditation, it just comes up like, oh, here's this past experience. And it's almost the divine intelligence of the body and our consciousness is like, okay, you can handle this now. Here's this little nugget from your past that needs to be looked at.
Mhm.
And it's a gentle process. Like, here it is. And then you start to work on it. And my experience with working with trauma has been like in and out, like up and down, where okay, this is here. I need to process this. And then things come along and it's, oh, okay, this is here. And to me, there's a wisdom in that. So pushing it always gets me nervous for people.
Yeah, I love your kind of ebb and flow that you describe. And I think for some people, absolutely, that's how it is. And people who are very, like yourself, aware, you are involved in mindfulness and meditation and things like that. I think some people just, their life is chaos and they're falling apart and they can't take it anymore, or relationships are suffering, or
Yeah.
they're not experiencing healing with SIRS. And so sometimes it's okay, they come to therapy, and I'm big about choice for people. There's a lot that we don't have control over in SIRS, and then when you experience trauma, power is taken away. And so I always want people to have a choice
Yeah.
in therapy. And so as they come in for sessions and I do the assessment and we build relationship and we look at their goals and understanding through our work, then if I sense they might not come in with healing trauma as a goal, they might, but they might not. As I sense, hey, I think this is
Mhm.
what the stuck point is, or the struggle you're having here, we identify how it relates to where the trauma stems. And then I say, is this something you would like to work on now if they're ready for it? Sometimes people say no, and I respect that.
Yeah.
I respect that. When you're ready, no, I'm here. Other times people say, yeah, because I want to heal. And so we walk that carefully. But yeah, healing trauma, like you're saying, the intensity of I need to heal my trauma and I need to heal it now, it can backfire on your nervous system unless you're in a place that you can navigate it effectively. And I don't want people to be like, okay, I'm never going to be in that place because I'm in SIR, I have SIRS and I'm a mess. No, you can.
Yeah.
It just requires some of the things that I look at for people before delving into the trauma work is where is their window of tolerance and is it becoming a little bit wider, right? Do they have the skills in place that if they become dysregulated, they know which ones to use and they're effective? Are they able to name their emotion and work towards responding versus reacting? It's not going to be perfect. Are they in a safe enough environment? Are they with the doctor working the protocol, have kind of some things in place there? And then because sometimes the trauma work, there's stuck points that we need to do the trauma work in order to release what's stuck,
Yeah.
right? So it's a balancing act, takes skill to really know when it's a good time for the client.
Yeah, because I was wondering too, as you were talking through that, there are those times where trauma just comes up and it needs to be addressed. I had a traumatic event, a death in my family, and it was like, this is here and it just is
Yes.
impacting me even functioning on a daily level. Like it has to be looked at. For those type of people, if that comes up in SIRS, do you see them more often or is it still very much their
Yeah.
choice? If you really have that heavy trauma present that
Mhm.
needs to be worked through to meet your daily needs, do you see people more frequently or is it still the weekly thing?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because recent trauma is handled very differently. So my previous response was more like
Yeah.
developmental past trauma that has just been underground in your body for a long time. Recent trauma, yeah, we want to deal with that as soon as we can. And there's a different process for that. especially I usually typically use EMDR for a recent event because what we know is that memories get more solidified after 2 years into your long-term memory. So if we can help the person process through that traumatic event sooner rather than later, it's less likely to cause as much long-term negative impact. I'll give my treatment recommendation for people and the invitation, and it's still up to what they can do
Yeah.
with their ability financially, mentally, emotionally. I can do more than one session a week. I also offer longer sessions, like an intensive, and that can be anywhere from 90 minutes to 3 hours for people to really work through some of those recent events.
That is great that you have that flexibility and openness to vary it based on those immediate needs or circumstances. That's amazing. What would you like the counseling psychology world to understand about environmental exposures and brain health?
Well, the first word that comes to mind is everything. But since not everybody's going to do that, I think what I would love for the counseling psychology world to know is, first of all, to know how it impacts the clients we see, the mental health impact of SIRS. And so knowing what SIRS is, understanding the symptoms, the importance of screening clients, of knowing the cognitive functioning, the neuropsychiatric symptoms, the presentations that we see in the therapy world, a lot of them can be SIRS related. Not all of them are, right? We're talking about 24% approximately of the population. And so there will be mental health diagnoses and struggles that aren't SIRS. But I think we're doing a disservice to people if we don't have a lens that we're looking through that understands the impact of environmental exposure and how that will impact the therapy world. And then knowing how to engage a treatment plan with clients who have SIRS so that it can be effective and not more frustrating for the client,
Yeah.
and really provide collaborative care, like work with the doctors, if there's a nutritionist, if there's a coach on board, right? Have collaborative care so the client is not having to relay communication in all of their sessions.
Can you share any stories about a SIRS patient who's gone to therapy or done some work with trauma? And you might be working with people going through SIRS who aren't doing the trauma piece as well, but any success stories of how it's benefited their health and their recovery?
Yes, absolutely. And HIPAA compliant. So I have clients who have been in therapy, they come to see me and just seem to not be able to get a handle on their anxiety. We go at it from every angle and are just, there's something not that's not effective, right? And so then once they get the SIRS diagnosis, they start on the Shoemaker protocol, and it doesn't happen instantaneously, but within a couple months, as long as they're in a safe enough space, I see their anxiety symptoms reducing. And and then the skills that they know work, right, better. I have clients who have been in chronic relapse with eating disorders and have been in treatment, come out, they have the best intentions, want to heal, and then a month or two later don't sustain it. Their body image is so bad, and their eating disorder thoughts and all the things come back. Then they get a SIRS diagnosis, begin to have less self-contempt, more understanding, more ability to have compassion for the body, and rather than being an enemy to the body, start to become part of the same team. And it shifts their ability to heal from trauma, eating disorder things as they're working the protocol.
Mhm.
And then just a lot of people where once they get the diagnosis, they start to have more hope. And I know part of the SIRS process can feel like there's a lack of hope when it becomes long and grueling and we're in the midst of the protocol and we feel stuck, or now there's a tick co-infection, or there's Lyme disease, or there's MCAS stuff, and we have to deal with all of the various impacts and other diagnoses that SIRS has caused damage around, and it can feel hopeless. Yet I also find that when people have been seeking answers or been in therapy for a long time and they're like, will I ever graduate from therapy? Once they get a diagnosis and they start to experience some shifts, find a lot more hope.
Let's go to some of the final questions as we wind our time down that I like to ask everybody. when they come to the show, if you could have one magic wish granted, what would you want to happen in the SIRS community?
Well, I have two.
Okay.
I don't know if I can narrow it down to one, but it'll be
Magic
short.
Genie says fine. Two is fine.
Okay. One of my dreams is I would love to have a residential center for people that is safe from a SIRS perspective, where people can heal, have 3 to 6 months where they can begin that healing process from SIRS and also have the mental health piece. So heal from trauma or anxiety, depression, OCD stuff, where they get the therapy piece and the medical piece combined. And it's an environment where they can experience healing also in community. That's the second piece is I would love for there to be spaces for more in-person connection because it's just so isolating. And I understand that. And the environment is a crucial to have a safe enough environment. And I just both personally experience the loneliness, but also just hear it all the time of how lonely and isolating the journey is. So even being able to have some like maybe weekend intensives that if I could find a safe enough place to have them where clients who want to can come, have
Yeah.
in-person support groups, some therapy if they want, but just really a healing space for people to connect.
That would be such an amazing, amazing addition to SIRS recovery. May that be so. That will happen. I'll put those
Yeah.
out there.
Yes.
And as somebody that's going through this and come a long way themselves, what keeps you hopeful day to day?
My pause is I I look at feeling hopeful and holding on to hope as different. So I don't always feel hopeful every day, right? I'm a therapist and I'm walking alongside hurting people and wanting to be their advocate and help them heal. And I'm also going through my own SIRS journey, healing journey, and I've have had several hiccups and different things I'm trying to navigate and all of the things that we all understand. And so there's some days where I feel discouraged or I feel this is taking a lot longer than I thought, or I'll have some exposure and I am down for the count for 4 days, right? And so I don't always feel hopeful in the moment, but I still have hope. And there's a difference, I think. And I think having hope is who or what do we anchor to in times of suffering and in times of pain? And for me, that has 100% been my faith and my relationship with God and knowing who He is. Not that He answers every prayer that I pray in the way that I want, but I'm not God, right? Not trusting Him because of a result, but trusting Him for who He is. And that's required me through various trauma in my own life, through a lot of loss I've experienced through death and different things. And really having to search out, okay, who are you, God? And what is the truth? And who do you say you are? And how do you see me? And as I've done that, then I anchor to Him. And so I look at it like if I'm a boat in a tumultuous sea, right? But I'm able to stabilize because of who my anchor is. And that's really what my anchor of hope. And on the days when I feel and I just maybe cry or I feel like this isn't the life that I wanted, right? I have to go back to my anchor because that's the only way I know to hold on and have that hope. So,
Thank you for that heartfelt answer and the very nuance of that. I really can resonate with that in many ways, and I'm sure others will be able to as well. We may not feel hopeful every day, but we can have trust in something greater than ourselves that things will work themselves out and that things will move forward
yeah,
and that
absolutely.
we're being held and loved in that process along the way, whether we feel it or not, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have to believe it,
Yeah. Absolutely.
even despite our feelings.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's true even for the professionals working with us, the doctors. Sometimes it's like, how many more supplements can I take? Right? Or many pills, but trusting that they know what they're doing and they're leading us in a direction of healing even when we don't feel like swallowing another pill.
Yeah, and trust in the body having some divine intelligence that if we can give it some good guidance, it's going to figure out how to get back to that place of more balance.
Yes, absolutely. I truly believe the brain and the body desire healing, right?
Yes,
They want to heal. It can just be complex to help it.
absolutely. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think it's going to be such a gift to the CIRS community for people to really understand how developmental trauma, how recent trauma can interrelate with a CIRS presentation, how there's this intersection with different brain health, mental health diagnoses, and eating disorders. That's such an important piece to bring into this conversation. I'm so glad that you're able to speak to that. And I just really want to acknowledge your journey. I know that it's been a road, and I'm glad, even though that it's been very difficult at times, that you've gleaned some beautiful wisdom and are finding purpose in that pain and giving back to CIRS patients. I'm sure that everyone that works with you is so grateful.
Oh.
How can people get in touch with you and be in contact with your work?
Yeah, well, before I give that information, I want to thank you for what you do and who you are to the community because you are an invaluable resource, and I know your wisdom. And I've spoken with people who have worked with you, and it is just amazing. And so, in the midst of your own journey and the pain and suffering you've endured, thank you for investing in the lives of those of us who have experienced help from you as well. So I'm deeply grateful.
That's
Um,
touching. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And to get in touch with me to answer your question, untamediona.com is the website. There's a page on there for services for therapy, and that'll have my contact information. Or you can email connect@untamediona.com. Those would be the two best ways to get in touch with me. There's a YouTube channel for Untamed Iona where we're going to be posting some different videos. So there's some resources, but the website is probably the easiest to get all of that, whether there's individual therapy or groups, or if somebody has a question about something else, feel free to reach out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. And please do take advantage of everything that Untamed Iona and Brenda have to offer. Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie.
Thank you for listening and for your kind attention. To keep in touch, follow the Heart of CIRS podcast on Instagram. You can visit melaniepensack.com/the Heart of CIRS to donate. Your generosity helps to keep this podcast growing. May the awareness of CIRS spread far and wide, helping to change millions of lives for the better.